Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Greg Helbeck, and welcome to this week's REI Weekly Deal Breakdown. On today's episode, I'm going to talk to you about a house that I wholesale in Camden, Wyoming, Delaware on 403 Eagle Nest Drive. I'm going to tell you how I found the deal, how we negotiated, how we sold the deal, and some challenges that happened. So hopefully, by the time you're done listening to this, you're going to be able to know exactly how we got this thing done step by step. If you're not familiar with me, my name is Greg Helbeck. I've bought and sold well over 200 houses. I got a seven-figure business on the East Coast. I run that business virtually from Reno, Nevada. So this is all information that comes from the real world, not some regurgitated theory. So if you do get value from today's podcast, if you could do me a favor and subscribe to our YouTube channel, or if you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, if you can share the show with other people, that's how we keep growing the show. 403 Eagles Nest Drive. This deal came from an inherited list direct mail. So we sent out direct mail to people who inherited properties, and the seller, John, called up and he spoke to Ryan on our team and he wanted to sell the house. He didn't live there. Him and his sister were the decision makers, and it was in a really nice area, right? It was a townhouse. I think there was another unit next to it, but it was really high end for Delaware. So he reached out. The property was vacant and he wanted to sell it for cash. So we decided to actually go meet this seller in person. So Brett on my team met John down in Camden, Wyoming, which is like an hour south of Newark, Delaware, where he lives. And I believe they settled on a final purchase price. By the way, this was after much follow-up, right? He didn't just sell us right on the spot. He was a delicate seller. He needed some nurturing. He wanted to not be forced into making the decision. So we were able to identify that. So when we actually made him the offer, he said that he needed some more time to think about it. And usually when you're dealing with a seller and they say they want to think about it, it's usually an excuse for them to not want to move forward with you. But in this case, he actually did need to think about it. It was a long process for him. Long story short, we end up agreeing on $255,000 to buy the property in terms of the purchase price. And then once we got the house under contract, I reviewed the deal and I figured what was going to be the best exit strategy here to reduce our risk, but then potentially maximize our profit. I looked at the deal and I saw that the property was definitely worth $350 as is. There was a comparable sale that was the neighbor's house that sold for $350 or $360, but that comparable was in better shape than John's. Now, John's house was in fairly good shape, but it was pretty dated, needed some updates, some paint, etc. And when I saw this other comp that only sold for 100 grand more and it was in better shape, I got a little spooked because I was like, you know what? By the time we close on this and pay the 4% transfer tax on the buy and the 2% transfer tax on the sale and all the commissions and hard money fees, I said, we probably only net 30 grand on this thing. And that's a lot of risk to take to maybe make $30,000, right? So I told Brett, I think if this value was more, and by the way, stay tuned later to find out how I made a mistake. If the value was more, definitely let's just buy it and relist it. But I said, hey, listen, if we can wholesale this thing out and make 20 grand and not have to get involved in closing it and any of the crazy logistics, let's just wholesale it. So I ended up putting the property out for wholesale. I think I put a $30,000 assignment fee on it and nobody wanted the property, which was a little odd. I get it because the numbers were a little tight at the number I put it out at. So I reduced the price by $10,000. I found a buyer who wanted it for a $20,000 assignment fee, which is pretty good. That's pretty much our standard minimum wholesale deal. So ended up getting a buyer, and I've never worked with this buyer before, so I was a little skeptical when I work with someone I've never transacted with. He was pretty cool. He was pretty compliant. Got everything wrapped up. We got all the contracts in play, and we're on a path to closing. And one of the stipulations with this deal was the seller was insistent upon closing in the new year. So we locked this thing up, I think in November or December of 2023, and he wanted to close in January 2024 for tax purposes because he didn't want to have that big tax hit at the end of the calendar year. So I told the buyer, we got to close this in January because the guy doesn't want to pay the taxes in 2023, even though he's ultimately going to pay the taxes, but it is what it is. So we ended up setting the closing up early January of 2024 and made $20,000, and it was all cool. And generally that's a solid win in the book. But however, this is where I think we made a big mistake on this deal. And this is the lesson I really want to communicate to everyone who's listening to this podcast is Brett was actually at a party with his fiance, and the people that he was at the party with were local to that Camden, Wyoming, Delaware area. And he told them how much we were buying this house for. And they were like, oh my God, you're getting it for that price? Are you kidding me? That's worth way more. And then after we found this out, we already had the property in contract with the buyer, so we couldn't just change the deal. And we wouldn't do that regardless. That's bad business. And we ended up looking at it, and it ended up being worth a lot more than we thought. I think that house is probably worth 370, potentially 380,000 as is. So we could have bought it for 255, closed on it and sold it for 370 without having to do much work, maybe some carpet and paint. So we realized like, ooh, we probably should have closed on this thing and made 40 or 50 grand instead of our $20,000 wholesale fee. So we realized that generally when we make that mistake, it's usually in areas that we're not super familiar with. Like in Newcastle County, we pretty much much have that on lock. We know the values, we know the people. But once we start getting properties in like the lower part of Delaware, we're not as sure on the value. So after we discuss that, we have a new plan in place. Anytime we get a property under contract down in the lower part of Delaware, we really are going to run it by a local real estate agent to get a absolute certain number on the as is value, because we can't be, buying these houses and wholesaling them for 20 grand when we can literally have just closed on them and made 50 to 60 grand, maybe 70 grand. So we realized that mistake. Obviously, not a bad mistake making $20,000, but when you leave that money on the table consistently, it can really add up at the end of the day. And when you look back on your year and you fell short of your revenue goals, you look back at your deals and you're like, wow, there's 4 or 5 houses here that I wholesaled that I could have just closed on and relisted, and I would have easily made an extra 100,000, 200,000 in net profit. So you really got to be aware of that. You don't want to give away too many of these houses when the numbers make sense. This one was a little bit of a tweener because there was a comp that was pretty low that I didn't like, but at the end of the day, there ended up being more comps that supported a higher value versus a lower value. So that's the biggest lesson I learned from this is, number one, don't wholesale really good deals. This one I would say was probably a double if we were to close on it, and we ended up turning into a single by wholesaling it. As you say, you can't go broke making a profit, but at the end of the day, really, if you don't know the values, you got to connect with a local real estate agent. You want to try to find somebody who's local to that town or city, in particular that zip code, and have them confirm the value for you, assuming they have other sales they've done that were local to that area. So that's lesson number one, is really get a local expert involved and confirm those values before you make a decision on what exit you want to use. And lesson number two here is very straightforward. A lot of people in sales say, you can't think about it, or, oh, you don't have any time to think about this. You have to give me a decision right now. And if we were to do that with the seller, he would have said, no, I'm not working with you guys. But we took the time to understand his needs and what brings the most value to him and his sister. And we actually found out that he needed time to think about it, because that's how this guy made decisions. And we were able to respect that decision. And because we didn't put the pressure on this guy, he sold to us when he probably could have sold to someone else for more money. At least that buyer he could have sold to for more money, because we obviously made an assignment fee off that. And he really respected our ability to work around his time frame. So sometimes you got to be delicate with sellers. You don't want to force them into a corner. So that's the second lesson on this. And overall, it was a pretty good deal. Making 20 grand ain't bad. It's certainly better than a sharp stick in the eye, as they say. So hopefully you got value from this. This was 403 Eagle Nest Drive in Camden, Wyoming, Delaware. If you did get value from this, once again, if you could subscribe to the podcast, subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if you're local to Delaware, the Hudson Valley, Reno, or San Diego, and you have a house you either want to wholesale to me, I am a buyer, or if you want to wholesale it with me, I can also joint venture with you on a wholesale basis. If you have any properties, send me a message on Instagram at Grego37, or you can send me an email, greg@velocityhousebuyers.com. I hope you enjoyed 403 Eagles Nest Drive, and I'll see you on the next REI deal breakdown. Take care.